Welcome to Tech Houblon, the podcast that explores information technology and our passion for beer. I'm your host, Luc Dumoulin, and in this episode recorded at Ben's Bar, we dive into the exciting world of information technology, from the latest news and trends to expert opinions. We cover it all, not to mention our beer recommendations. Whether you're a fan of technology, good beer, or a curious listener, there's always something new to learn on each episode. Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Tech and Houblon. Today, we're diving into transitioning from SAP ECC to S/4HANA for Canadian organizations. I'm Luc Dumoulin, your host, and as always, we're blending IT expertise with good company, and sometimes over a great beer. For this episode, I'm pleased to welcome Dan Chase, Enterprise Solution Architect at R2I and a true expert in SAP ERP systems. Hello, Dan.
Hi, Luc. How are you doing today?
Great, thank you. And thank you for joining us and our listeners today. Before we go any further, I'd love for you to introduce yourself to our audience and tell us what led you to join R2I.
Well, thanks, Luc. My name's Dan Chase. I've been working in the IT industry for 25, 30 years or so. I had worked with the founders of R2I. Actually, we go back at least 20 years or so from my time when I was at IBM. We worked together either in IBM or even as R2I became one of the fastest growing partners in Canada. This is kind of my second go around with R2I. I originally joined R2I back in 2021, and we worked together for a few years, and then I've recently returned about 6 months ago, again because I truly believe in the organization and the values that they espouse. A little bit about my background. So I spent 7 years in the federal government, early on in my career, being as a infrastructure architect, building out various systems across the country. I then moved into used to work for a Linux distributor called SUSE. We spent 7 years there as a systems engineer. Yeah. My time spent there, and again, I started working with many of the IBMers, and they convinced me to join IBM back in the early 2000s. Spent over 15 years at IBM, and probably most of my time, that's kind of when I transitioned into the SAP world. So spent about 16 years focused in SAP architecture and infrastructure, supporting SAP systems for various customers across the country.
That's a pretty heavy resume you've got.
Yeah, thanks, Luc. Yeah, I also, actually, it's kind of interesting. Like I mentioned, I did join R2I for a period of time early on in 2021. Yeah. I then spent a little bit of time, about 3 years at SAP, actually focused specifically on some of their software technologies and working with public sector clients, focused on the federal government and the high security environments, specifically around their business technology platform. So I kind of have a mix of, yes, direct SAP experience along with working as a partner of SAP when I was at my time at IBM. So close to 20 years background in that SAP space.
Well, that's why we call you an ERP systems expert.
Yeah.
Well, as I mentioned in the intro, today's topic is transitioning from SAP ECC to S/4HANA. Then let's start with a bit of background by defining a few key terms here. What's ECC, HANA, S4, and finally S/4HANA?
So if we look at what SAP ECC stands for. So SAP was what is a core ERP, so ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning. But ECC, what it officially stands for is ERP Central Component. What does that mean? What that really means is that's core to every business. So if we think of the basic function of a business, right, we need to procure product, or we need to sell product or services, etc. So all the invoicing and the financial components of that. Yeah. SAP was originally founded by, actually, which is interesting, 3 former IBMers. So the structure is very similar to IBM from a business perspective, but they needed to come up with software initially running on a mainframe. It then transitioned in the 90s to the whole client server space. And then over time, it's progressed to basically to today's world, which is really the S4. If we talk about S4, S4 is really the transition from originally the SAP ERP system. The version was R3. So if we think of R3, S4, new version. What SAP did when they moved to S4 is one of the things they came out with about, I guess it's going on 10, 12 years or so. They came out with something called SAP HANA. HANA was an in-memory database. So if we think of something like Oracle DB, DB2, Microsoft SQL Server. Yeah. So when we hear the term HANA, that's what they're really talking about in layman's term. It's the database component. The S4, the previous R3 or SAP ECC system actually ran on DB2, on SQL Server, on Oracle, MySQL, all the various databases. When SAP came out with S4, what really came out there was it would only run on the HANA database. That's why you hear the term S4 HANA.
Oh, I see.
Okay, so if that makes sense.
What's so special about HANA itself?
Well, really, it has to do with how the database is structured. So in the past, a traditional database is rows with row-based. You know, when we did a transaction, you added the transaction to the bottom of the list, right? It's basically like a list with columns, just like an Excel spreadsheet. If we think of traditional databases, that's how they're structured. The HANA database is what we call a columnar database. They actually flip it on its side. What that does is that makes reading the system super fast. It's much easier to search for things when it's structured that way. It also reduces requirements to create extra special tables. The other thing it does is because we put it in memory in a system is much faster than accessing a disk subsystem, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. So a couple of things happen there. We can reduce the size. If we think about it, you know, some people have terabytes and terabytes of data, right? The reality is once we move that data into memory, we actually reduce the size. We reduce requirements for things like indexes, for special tables, etc. We don't need those anymore because the system can access it so fast because it's in memory. We actually can build and access the data much, much faster. We don't have to build special tables or indexes like we do in a traditional database. So that's kind of a key difference, right?
Yeah, that's very interesting as a concept. Okay, now tell me, why are we talking about SAP transition today? And as a sub-bullet, what role can R2I play into it?
So if we think about from a traditional perspective, you know, eventually software goes out of support. Let's be honest. So to give you some background, the SAP ECC system has gone through, there's different names. You may hear things like Business Suite, SAP Business Suite, R3, like it went from R3 to Business Suite to SAP ECC. At the end of the day, those three products are more or less the same product.
Okay.
That product has been around since the late 90s. It's the same software that was created in the 90s with enhancement packs, etc. They haven't really changed the version of the software. So what happened when SAP came out with S4, it was a major transition. What they've done now is the timeline is in 2027, and if we think of our timeline right now, we're in 2025, right? We're halfway through 2025 or a little more, right? We're in July right now. So 2027, mainstream maintenance for SAP ECC is done. It's no longer going to be in mainstream maintenance. SAP, with that in mind, right? So what's happening is that's basically forcing customers that run ECC, and if we think of the numbers, right, 70 to 80% of transactions in the world go through an SAP ERP system. They have to transition, right? We've got a timeline crunch. Now, SAP has understood that. So what they've done is they've come out with an extension. So you can pay SAP some additional funding for basic support from 2027 to 2030.
Okay.
okay, to give customers a little more time to transition. But there is a cost, there's a financial impact by doing that.
I see.
The second thing they've done is for some of their very large customers, and this is only on a special case basis, if the customer signs a contract, they can extend that timeline to 2033, but that's only for very special high profile customers. Most of us in Canada, we're in the small, medium range when we talk about worldwide. Obviously, there is some very large SAP instances in Canada, some of the largest, but from a numbers perspective, there's probably more in the medium range across the country.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So customers have to make that transition. Now, with that, where R2I can help really is with my background from an advisory perspective, there's a bunch of considerations you have to take into account. SAP is really focused on an offering, and you may hear it around, they call it, you've heard about Rise with SAP and Grow with SAP. And I think this year they've actually might have even changed the name, right? They're talking about the public S/4HANA Cloud Public Edition, S/4HANA Cloud Private Edition. They've kind of muddled up the market a little bit, but really there's a certain set of choices that customers can make. So their Rise offering is really their S4 offered as software as a service. So a SaaS cloud offering. It is basically a subscription basis based on users, size of the system, so on and so forth, which you work through customers. So that is a full cloud SaaS offering, contracting with SAP. So that means that SAP has control of the system, they manage it, they do patching, etc. So from a client perspective, if we think of in Canada, we have to take a look at what are our choices. So our other options are really, we can go with infrastructure as a service with a cloud provider. Maybe it's a Canadian cloud provider like R2I, which has the four data centers in Canada, making sure that it managed, secure, etc. in Canada. You can run IaaS with a hyperscaler, whether that's, we all know the Googles and the Microsofts and AWS and IBM as well, right? So you have those options as well. Again, when we go with certain environments, we have a certain level of control we have. So we can go full SaaS, software as a service, and just license it SAP contract. The other option is if we want to keep some control over our environment, we want to control, i.e. data sovereignty, we want to control security, we want to control when systems are upgraded, then we need to consider our own platform. So that could be continue to run on-prem in our own data center, which gives us full control of the hardware. That also may going to a cloud provider like R2I, providing IaaS, infrastructure as a service, and we still have the control of the software. Maybe we let somebody else manage the infrastructure and the hardware, right? So it's really taking a look at what your requirements are from that perspective.
You're talking about infrastructure. IBM just recently announced, well, in fact, this week, the Power 11. Do you see any value in running that new SAP S/4HANA on Power 11?
Absolutely. So one of the things that the IBM Power Platform does bring to the table versus the x86 environment is really consolidation, right? We can reduce our footprint. It has built-in security within the hardware itself, so you don't have to layer something on top. It's already the full security and encryption is all totally, completely built in. From a performance perspective, we get higher core memory ratios, so we reduce the number of how large the system needs to be. We can consolidate into a single system, of course, if it's a fairly large implementation. It also has built into it the 6.9 availability. So if we think of 6.9, right, in the past we had 5.9s and now everybody thought that was great. We're now getting to 6.9 with a mid-range platform, which is something, the only other platform that could do that was, of course, the IBM mainframe, right?
Right.
The other thing Power brought to the table is zero downtime for planned maintenance, right? So you're able to patch the system basically live, so the system can continue to run. Again, I look at that and go, wow, that's something that's been in the mainframe for years, right? They had their Sysplex technology where, you're doing an Oracle upgrade, well, it keeps running, right? All the banks, why is the mainframe still around? It's because, there are requirements for systems that can never go down.
Exactly.
Right. And now IBM's introducing that technology into their Power Platform.
That's cool. All right. Now we've talked about infrastructure. Let's go back into more the software itself. What are the possible approaches? I've heard of Greenfield, Brownfield, and to a lesser extent, Bluefield. What do they mean, and which one is the best fit?
Yeah. So really, the best fit is, and this is, it's kind of funny, right? We everybody in the IT industry say this. It depends, right?
It depends. You're right. But you're the expert.
But at the end of the day, it does depend on the customer. I've worked with one department that, so if we think about, they actually were running their core financial system on Oracle, right? Oracle, the number 2 financial system in the world, right? So they were running Oracle. They actually were making the transition to SAP. So what would they want to do? Well, let's think about it, right? So they've got this Oracle system. They're going to SAP. It makes sense to go, and I'll call this Greenfield. Greenfield is basically fresh, new, nice, green pasture, no legacy. I'm not bringing my old code. I'm just bringing a nice, fresh, new system. And I start at the beginning. I take the data from my older system and maybe I transition that into something like a business warehouse or that, because I will have requirements to still get access to that financial data, right? The standard practice is 7 years, but in many cases, there are organizations that need to keep longer than 7 years. But we transition that into a warehouse or a data repository, so I have access, and then I start fresh. I don't bring everything over. You then have Brownfield, right? So we have our Greenfield, then we have Brownfield. Brownfield is really taking what I'm running today and I transition everything over, right? So I take my any customizations that I've built. I bring all that stuff. I bring all my data over into my new system and I fix it and tweak it and try and make it work. Now, Brownfield, again, there are instances where you may do that. If we look at an organization that has many customizations, they may do that, or maybe they have a small number of customizations. They may do a Brownfield because I want to bring everything over and I want to shut down the old system and don't want to deal with it. They have this concept of Bluefield, and then depending on the SI, they may change that. Some call it Bluefield, some call it, they may call it something else, right? That's really what we call, think of it as a combination of green and brown is basically
and brown. That gives blue. All right.
I have no idea. You'd think they would have come up with, I have no idea. I think they would have come up with something else, but the idea there is, we talk about public cloud, private cloud, and we talk about hybrid. Well, Bluefield is hybrid. We do a combination of, yes, maybe I bring my data over, all my data comes into the system, but maybe I take a look at my customizations and maybe I go, okay, well, I don't need these customizations anymore. I change my business process, from a coding perspective, right? That's what we do. I do want to touch on something there. So when we're doing that transition, and this is where it gets interesting on where do I run this, right? So if we went into, let's say, a full SaaS model with SAP, we have some considerations there, because what SAP, the idea is they're going to manage, let's say not everything, but let's say they're going to manage 80% of it. So enhancement packs, patches to the system, new functionality, they will take care of that. That's part of a SaaS offering, just like other vendors, right? You buy software as a service and they're taking care of it. Where the line gets drawn is, in many cases, is what happens when I have customizations? What happens if I do have to have customizations? Yes. If an upgrade is happening, what's going to be the impact? If I go sign up for a full SaaS offering, what happens now? I don't have control of when upgrades are done necessarily, right? So that's where I have to start to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe it makes sense to keep running my S4 on-prem. The S4 on-prem, which will be supported, and SAP has stated, till 2040. So we have at least 15 years of running S4 on-prem, S4 in IaaS environments. Some considerations, people might turn around and say, well, wait a minute. Okay, but I want to take advantage of cloud, right? I want the cloud economics. There are offerings, and like IBM Power Virtual Server, you can actually acquire Power Virtual Server on-prem.
Oh.
You're paying cloud, you're using cloud economics, but the system physically sits in your data center. Well, what does that give you? That gives you full control of the environment, the security, everything is, you're able to take advantage of that, right?
That's great. So that's called the private cloud, isn't it?
Private cloud. Well, that's kind of where it gets interesting, because yes, that is private cloud, but you could also get private cloud from, for example, R2I, right? You get dedicated infrastructure. It's in R2I's data centers, one of the 4 data centers that we have available, but it's your dedicated infrastructure, as an example, right? You could do that as well. So you can either have private cloud in your data center, you can have private cloud in an IaaS provider, right? Like R2I.
Well, we're getting close to the end of this episode. Anything you'd like to add?
I really think we need to, have customers really need to take a step back and look at their transition. This timeline, it's getting short. Something has to be done, in the next, in the next 2 years, let's say, 2027 it's less than 18 months away. So there is a little bit of time, but they're going to want to don't just jump in blindly into, I have to go to a full SaaS offering. You need to step back and take consideration of your security requirements, data sovereignty requirements, because of our friends down south. So, but no, data sovereignty is a big issue. We want to be aware of the Patriot Act. Let's be honest. We have to be aware of the Patriot Act, because it means that if you're putting data into a company, a U.S.-based company, that means that at any point in time, you can be requested the data. There has been some considerations around, you have your keys, etc. Yeah, but it still means that they have access to that. So customers really need to step back and go, okay, wait a minute. We have to deal with data sovereignty. We have to make sure that it's managed by Canadian resources. We take control of the environment and continue to run it on-prem. And we have time, right? We've got until 2040 if we decide to go to S4 and take advantage of all the functionality that SAP has available to us with the latest versions. But you really want to take consideration to the platform that you choose.
Excellent. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Tech Houblon. And we got a wealth of information. Dan, thank you so much for joining us. And
Thanks, Luke.
And to you, our loyal listeners, thank you for tuning in. And stay alert for our upcoming podcast, where we'll explore other topics from the world of information technology. Thank you.